Today, if you run a business, there's a good chance that data lies at its heart. But how do you know that the data you're using is actually good data? How do you know it's not subject to inaccuracies, biases, or even manipulation? Today, we're asking what are the strategies you should use to ensure that your data is fit for purpose. I'm talking to Paul Doherty, Michael Biltz, and Elise Cornell. Paul, I guess today every business, no matter what business it is to some degree a data-driven business, which obviously means that the quality of the data has to be up to scratch. To what degree is that actually happening, though?
Yeah, I mean, data is the fuel of the economy now and going forward. I think that's one of the key points that we need to consider as we think about the role of data in organizations, and it's the scale of data is what's really changing, and it's been changing for years. So companies are regularly dealing with petabytes of information now, which was unthinkable not too many years ago. And it's different forms of information. It's unstructured data, it's video, it's inputs from social media, connected devices, whatever it might be. And that's and the companies that can make sense out of that data and can understand what the patterns in that data are going to win and be more competitive, and they're going to grow their businesses faster. So when we think about data veracity, it's about how do you develop the capability to take advantage of the information in that way, but then how do you also make sure you guard against some of the issues that you can run into with data. For example, one thing that we talk to a lot of companies about is the fact that having a lot of data can be a liability, because if you get hacked, the data you're vulnerable for the data. It's reputational risk. You have to think about what data do you save if the data is at risk. Yeah. So there's issues like that to think about, and there's broader issues like how good is the data you have, how well does it represent your business, how clean is the data, et cetera. So lots of things to think about with data.
So how do companies guard themselves against using bad data? And what kind of forms does this bad data take? Is it just in bad data collection? Is it that there's no one verifying it at the company?
Yeah, well, you start with the forms that it takes, because I think it really emphasizes the huge challenges companies have, is that bad data comes in a million different forms. And it's everything from a sensor going bad in a field and one day giving you good data and the next day giving you terrible data. It's your consumers, when they lie about how old they are as they sign up, is that there's little things everywhere, not to mention that once you actually take malicious things that say hackers can probably do more damage to an oil company by telling them to drill in the wrong place than they ever could, by stealing a little proprietary data.
So when we talk of bad data, a lot of people do think about malicious actors using data or trying to manipulate data. But actually, a large part, it seems almost, the majority of the problem is just that there's no one verifying that data back at base.
No, and I think that's right, is that you've essentially got two organizations that are very common in every company. Is that you've got your security on one side, who are looking for those bad actors to come in and usually worried about stealing data. And then you've got all of your data scientists who are trying to figure out the correlation and how you read the tea leaves. But there's very few companies right now that have a dedicated intelligence practice, for lack of a better term, who's trying to do nothing but verify the truth in that data.
And there's some extraordinary figures that I've come across in the research here. 97% of business decisions are made using data that even the company's own managers consider is bad quality, and yet somehow it still seems to siphon through and be the crux of business decisions.
Yeah, and it's all focus. Because the thing is that there's so many different things, if you're not thinking about it, that can creep in to make good data bad. That says if it's too old, it might be bad. If it was actually gathered for a different purpose and you're trying to reuse something that was never intended before, is you get all kinds of creep of bad stuff in. United Airlines, recently went back and looked at the data they were using to predict their flight patterns. And what they realized is that the data they're using is essentially insights that they got from decades-old patterns on what flights were needed, how they were using it, when people were taking flights, and essentially what they, concluded is that they were missing out on $1 billion worth of revenue by looking at old data.
We've heard about the importance of having a core intelligence agency, if you like, within organizations to ensure that you have got good, clean data. But it doesn't just stop there, does it?
No, I mean, I think data veracity is not just someone else's job. You know, it needs to be a mindset, a culture of an entire company, so that everyone feels responsible for not only, you know, making sure the data they use is accurate, but that they are applying it to the right decisions. Because the business decisions that are made at both at an individual level all the way up to a corporate level, they make major differences, and they make major impacts on the bottom line, on the future of a company, and how it's serving and playing a role in society.
So tell me how we can try and plot a way forward here. You know, you've talked about maybe creating some internal agency at organizations to try and make sure there's clean data. How would that operate?
You're essentially trying to figure out where your data's coming from, what you're going to be using for, which most people do today, but suddenly differently as you're trying to figure out what's the incentives and behaviors for people to tell the truth when they hand you that data. What's the verification that you're using to make sure that all that data that comes in is actually the correct data. You know, companies like SpaceX, you know, actually use pairs of computers every time they run calculations. They want to make sure that anything that they decide to do is not done just off of one calculations, but off of multiple calculations, so they can have a higher set of confidence that it's true.
If you had to give one takeaway for business, you've mentioned the idea of, you know, having some kind of central agency, if you like, within businesses. What would you say, though, is the main takeaway for business here?
Yeah, the main takeaway is to really, now's the time to invest in your data and to think about how do you create the right data sets that's going to drive your enterprise going forward. And it's a bit of a counterintuitive or controversial notion for business, because investing in the data itself doesn't necessarily give you an ROI. There's not necessarily a business case around doing that specifically. But and it often cuts across many systems and many departments, but we think that that's the kind of step that organizations need to take. Invest in your data and the quality of your data and the accessibility of your data so that it can fuel the systems that you need, you know, the AI systems and other systems that you need to drive your business.